Hi, and welcome back to The Lowest Crime, the podcast all about true crime from one of the lowest countries in the world, the Netherlands. I'm Eline, and today we're diving into the tragic and honestly infuriating case of Corrie van Geesbergen, a 91-year-old woman whose death initially seemed like a natural passing, but soon revealed itself to be a murder that was tragically overlooked by authorities. Please be aware that today's episode includes descriptions of physical violence and murder, so listener discretion is advised. And just a reminder, I do my very best to bring you all the known facts, but I am just an amateur podcast creator, so there is always a chance of me making a mistake. Without further ado, let's get into the tragic murder of Corrie van Geesbergen. Corrie van Geesbergen was not your typical 91-year-old. Where many people may picture a frail old lady, Corrie was quite the opposite and defied the typical expectations for someone her age. She lived alone in The Hague and was quite capable of taking care of herself. She did her own shopping, walked to the store, and still handled most household tasks herself, only getting help with the larger chores. She enjoyed her routines, her weekly hair appointments, a small drink, and a cigarette. She still fully embraced life. For 61 years, she had lived in her small home on the corner of the Erasmusweg and the Leijeweg in Den Haag. She had moved into the house as a young woman and just never left. It became the silent witness to her entire adult life, the place where she had welcomed family, celebrated holidays, and had watched generations grow up. Corrie loved her family, making sure to always stay in touch with them. She would call every morning and every evening with her daughter, just to make sure everything was okay. She also very much loved her granddaughter, Gabrielle. Although I am sure she had more family members, I wasn't quite able to find any details, so these two are going to be the main focus in the story. From as early as Gabrielle can remember, her relationship with Corrie was deeply loving. When Gabrielle was young, Corrie filled the holidays with warmth. Sinterklaas, Christmas, Easter, whatever the celebration, Corrie was a part of it. Good weather meant they would go to the beach together, and every spare penny was saved for a trip to Madurodam, which they loved. Her granddaughter remembers that they always had so much mischief at her house. My brother even messed around with a lighter and deodorant, probably starting a fire around 3 times, and she would be strict, but she would never get angry. As an adult, Gabrielle would still often get in her car and drive to Corrie's house, often bringing some sweets. And each time, without fail, Corrie would press 10 euros into her hand, saying, "For the gas." But on May 8th, 2019, everything changed. Granddaughter Gabrielle and her mother were out together buying a Mother's Day present for Corrie. They were stopped at a traffic light near the train tracks when the phone rang. It was Gabrielle's aunt. The message was short but clear. "It's Mom. She's died." What followed was just shock, confusion, and disbelief. Although Corrie had been in her 90s, she had still been such a fit woman. So this came out of nowhere. They immediately turned the car around and headed straight to Corrie's house, trying to make sense of what had happened. That morning, the home care worker had come for a routine visit. She had rang the doorbell as always, but Corrie hadn't answered. Thinking that she might be out or busy, the worker went to another client first. Later, she returned and rang the doorbell again, but still no answer. At that moment, Gabrielle's aunt had arrived at the house, who had a key, so she opened the door and the two of them went inside. Inside the kitchen, they found Corrie, face down on the kitchen floor, with a wound on her forehead and blood on the ground beneath her. Based on her old age and a distant history of heart issues, officers concluded almost immediately that her death must have been due to natural causes. Most likely, she had suffered from heart failure and had collapsed on the floor, causing her head wound. So, Corrie's body was moved from the hallway to the bed. And, as a courtesy to the family, the blood that had been on the kitchen floor was cleaned up by the responding officers. When Corrie's relatives arrived, some after driving 30 to 45 minutes, the police were already gone. No paramedics, no forensic specialists, no investigators. Just a quiet house and the news that their beloved mother and grandmother had passed away and was now laying on the bed. The family was in disbelief. Corrie may have been 91, but she had been active and mentally still very sharp. Yet, within minutes of her being found, the possibility of anything other than a natural death had been ruled out. The scene had been cleared, and the family was left with a conclusion that felt too simple. But although the circumstances felt strange and certain details didn't sit right, the family initially accepted the conclusion that Corrie must have died a natural death. So, there was no other choice than beginning their grieving process and moving forward with arranging her cremation. But then, when the funeral director arrived, she asked the family whether there was anything else she could do for them. The family explained that Corrie always wore her jewelry, 2 necklaces and 2 or 3 bracelets and her rings, and that they would like her to wear them during the funeral. So, the funeral director went into the bedroom to check. Moments later, she returned with unexpected news. The necklaces and bracelets were nowhere to be found, only the rings remained. That detail immediately raised questions because Corrie had been unable to take that jewelry off herself. She had always needed help getting them off. Still, no one was thinking the worst. The family contacted the police to report the items missing, but even then, no alarms were raised. It was easy to assume that jewelry had simply been taken, stolen by someone who passed through the house. The family was overwhelmed, and in those first hours it was hard to question anything. When the family reported the jewelry missing to the police, their concerns were initially downplayed, telling them to come back on Sunday. And it wasn't until 4 days later, when the family filed a formal report, that the investigation truly began. And that's when Corrie's body was finally seized, and the investigators began to piece together the circumstances of her death. By the time the report was made, the scene of the crime, Corrie's home, had already been accessed by multiple people. The authorities had described it as a crime scene, but in practice, the home had been entered repeatedly. Cleaning had taken place, including the removal of the blood that had been on the floor. Corrie's aunt had placed the bloodied items in a garbage bag, which had already been emptied. Any trace of those early signs had been lost, making the work of investigators that much more difficult. Despite these challenges, the authorities proceeded with a full investigation. 2 autopsies were conducted to determine the cause of death, one in the Netherlands and a second in Belgium. The families were only told part of the findings, but both autopsies came to the shocking conclusion that Corrie hadn't died of natural causes at all, but confirmed that she had been killed by asphyxiation or strangulation. The initial assumption of natural death, based on her age and past heart issues, had been entirely incorrect. Corrie had been murdered. The official cause of death was a harsh and painful revelation. The family was already struggling with the loss, but discovering that Corrie had been murdered rather than passing away naturally made the grief so much worse. This revelation also marked a turning point. What had begun as shock and confusion now became the focus of a police investigation. Adding to the tragedy was the series of mistakes that would make this case so much more difficult than it needed to be. The initial responders moved Corrie's body to the bed, cleaned the blood from the floor, and handled the scene without considering the possibility of foul play. An attending physician concluded quickly that it was a natural death, and it hadn't been until the funeral director had arrived to prepare Corrie for her cremation that the missing necklaces and bracelets were noticed. Police now faced a nearly impossible task. Although the exact timeline of the murder remained uncertain, it was believed to have occurred sometime between the late evening and the following morning. Corrie, an early riser, would typically start her day with a cigarette and coffee, wash and dress, and sometimes step onto her first-floor balcony. While it's unlikely that anyone entered before 6 a.m., the possibility remains that someone visited her either late the previous evening or early the next morning. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Corrie may have willingly opened the door. What strengthened that theory was a phone call that had happened the previous evening. The night before her death, Corrie had been on her usual phone call with her daughter around 10 p.m. when, during the call, Corrie mentioned that someone was at the door. Her daughter reminded her that it was late and that she shouldn't be opening the door at that hour. But Corrie, however, being the independent woman that she was, insisted on checking anyway. She had an old phone with a cord, and after placing the receiver down, she walked over to the door. Her daughter did not hear the full conversation that followed, but did hear some fragments of a voice and hurried talking. She could not tell who had been at the door or what exactly was said. When Corrie returned to the phone, she said something about a visitor. She described the person as being a home care worker, though she had not expected anyone that evening, and why would they come this late? It was unclear whether the visitor had been a man or a woman. Her daughter, concerned, advised her not to open the door again this late, but Corrie brushed it off. The conversation ended, and they went to bed, planning to speak again the following morning. At first, this interaction didn't cause any additional concern, but finding out that she had been murdered rather than dying of natural causes sparked the memory to resurface. This had been the night before Corrie's death was discovered, and the police seriously considered the possibility that the person who rang the doorbell that evening could have been the same person or people who returned the next day. Although the police were in a tough spot given that so much evidence was already destroyed before even starting the investigation, there were still some potential leads. Some nighttime surveillance footage showed someone loitering nearby, but it was impossible to determine if it was connected to the crime. However, in the early morning hours of May 8, 2019, so the day of Corrie's murder, at around 4:45 a.m., a neighbor reported seeing a suspicious woman near the Erasmusweg, close to where Corrie lived. The police considered her a potential key witness. She was described as being between 20 and 30 years old, roughly 160 to 165 centimeters tall, with a light to slightly tanned complexion, and possibly of Eastern European origin. She wore a black padded jacket, tight black pants, and had the hoodie of a sweater pulled tightly around her face. Despite this detailed description, investigators were never able to identify her. No one came forward, and no new leads connected her to the scene or to anyone involved. Slowly, the momentum drained out of the investigation. With no suspects, no breakthroughs, and no way to trace the mystery woman, the police eventually ran out of avenues to pursue, so tragically, the case grew cold. For years, the case sat dormant in the archives, until the Peter R. de Vries Foundation's podcast, Tegen het Licht, discussed Corrie's case in a recent episode. Although the renewed attention didn't reopen the case, it still did something very important. It pushed Corrie's name back into the public conversation. In this podcast, they did not only talk about Corrie's case, but also urged people to take a look at their own jewelry. Maybe they had bought some bracelets or necklaces close to the date of Corrie's passing, and they therefore referred people to pictures of Corrie's jewelry to compare. However, sadly, nothing has come of this. Although Corrie's daughter was called into the police station to take a look at photos that had come in of potentially her mother's items, she was gravely disappointed when the jewelry shown didn't even in the slightest resemble any of her mother's. All the family wants to know is why. Corrie never hurt a fly. She was such a kind and caring person. The jewelry that was stolen was worth a lot to us because of sentimental value, but when it comes to actual market value, you wouldn't get much for them, so that wouldn't be worth the trouble. So with the investigation being stuck, the family continues to urge anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. If you remember seeing someone near Corrie's apartment or know anything about the stolen jewelry, You could be the one to help crack this case. Corrie's case is a particularly tragic one. A case that was doomed from the start when it was assumed that she had died of old age. This truly shows how, no matter how simple a case may seem, to always keep an eye out for possible signs of foul play, so that families can get the closure they deserve. In an interview with Corrie's daughter, she was asked what her mother would think of all this attention now being focused on her. Her daughter laughed and said, she would have said, "Wat een poppenkast." Roughly translated, "What a circus," or "What a fuss." And that is it for today. Thank you all so much for listening. If you appreciated this episode, feel free to leave a like or a comment or subscribe to the podcast, or find my Patreon page in the show notes. The next episode is already available there. So thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.